In 1546, a woman named Anne Askew sat in a damp lower room of the Tower of London and documented the absolute limits of human endurance. Smuggled out of her confinement, her own written account describes what happened when her interrogators could not break her resolve. She wrote that they did put me on the rack till I was nigh dead, and that I fainted, and yet she would not name others. Anne Askew is only one name in a building full of them. The day is over. The modern world has retreated. The last visitors have dispersed, taking their noise out into modern London. Here, inside the concentric walls, the dampness of the air registers first. It carries the scent of ancient river mud, cold salt, and sweating limestone. The tower does not raise its voice, it simply closes the door behind you. Tonight we walk these silent grounds together, moving room by room, stone by stone. We are not here to witness terror as it happens. That time has long passed. We are here merely to remember, gently and quietly, what these walls absorbed. Because in the 16th century, once the deep, heavy, metallic grinding of a massive iron key turned in a centuries-old lock, the outside world ceased to exist. In the quiet dark, you belong to the stone now. Welcome to History for Sleepyheads. I am glad you found your way here tonight. Lights off, headphones on. If you find comfort in these descents into the darker corners of our past, please leave a gently placed like. It helps our sleepy archive grow. If you'd like to wander through more quiet corners, consider subscribing. And before you drift off, tell me where you're listening from tonight and what hour it is where you are. Tonight we have a long atmospheric journey ahead of us, 10 chapters of deep, quiet, uninterrupted history. We will begin our walk with the machine in the lower room, looking closely at the heavy wooden frame of the rack. Then the walk to Tower Green, tracing the quiet footsteps of the condemned. We will examine what they were trying to pull out of you, the medieval mind, the laws of treason, and the warrants authorizing the pain. We will spend time with the woman they put on the rack, exploring the written account of Anne Askew. We will look at the other machines, the iron shadows of the Scavenger's daughter and the manacles, before meeting the men who did the work. We will trace the signature that changed, the trembling ink of Guy Fawkes in the deep vault, and read the names in the stone, the carved graffiti still legible today. We will recall 3 small mercies, the quiet acts of kindness that pierced the gloom, and finally, the stone that remembers, looking at how the legacy of judicial pain faded into the past. So, if you haven't already, turn down the brightness on your screen. Let your eyes fall heavy and shut. Pull the blankets close around you and let the modern world fade away. We are standing at the edge of the moat, the water black and still under a pale moon. Listen to the slow turning of the great key in the lock. Our night walk begins. London, the late 1440s. A nobleman named John Holland, the Duke of Exeter and Constable of the Tower, takes a deliberate step into the shadows of English history. He is a military man, a man of logistics, authority, and brutal pragmatism. He lives in a volatile era, an England teetering on the edge of the dynastic bloodshed that will become known as the Wars of the Roses. Paranoia is the currency of the court. Treason is a constant whisper, and to extract those whispers, Holland brings across the English Channel a new piece of engineering. He oversees its installation in the deep stone belly of the royal fortress. It is a large, heavy apparatus. It is constructed of seasoned English oak, thick forged iron, and heavy braided hemp rope. Holland does not give this machine a clinical, administrative name. He does not name it for a weapon of war, or a mythical beast, or a nightmare. Instead, he, or the warders who work beneath his command, bestows upon this apparatus a strange, terrible affection. They call it the Duke of Exeter's daughter. Listen to that name, the Duke of Exeter's daughter. It sounds like a gentle one. It sounds like someone you might arrange a marriage with, someone who sits in a sunlit parlor, surrounded by tapestries, quietly working a bone needle through silk. And the worst part isn't the irony, or the heavy oak frame or the iron chains. The worst part is what that name reveals about the men who stood beside it. They did not view this machine as a horrifying anomaly. They viewed it as a dutiful member of the royal household, an obedient, patient child waiting quietly in the dark to do her father's work. Tonight, we are going down into the stone to meet her. Listen, the deep, heavy, metallic grinding of the great key turning in the lock. The daytime world is gone. The heavy wooden door swings inward, groaning on iron hinges forged before the discovery of the New World. We are stepping out of the cool night air and into the descending passageways. The transition is immediate and physical. The temperature drops by several degrees. The air grows thick, heavy with the scent of the nearby river, a damp, ancient smell of tidal mud, sweating limestone and salt. You can feel the moisture collecting on the walls, slick beneath your fingertips if you were to reach out and touch the stone. We are moving downward. The stone steps are worn into shallow, uneven dips in the center, hollowed out by the heavy boots of warders, the soft shoes of the condemned, the slow tread of history. It is a quiet descent. The deeper you go, the more the sounds of the outside world, the distant hum of the city, the wind off the Thames, the cry of a night bird, are swallowed by the immense mass of the fortress.
The walls grow thicker. The ceiling arches low. You are entering the subterranean world of the tower. Down here, there is no weather. There is no season. There is no morning and no evening. There is only a permanent, heavy twilight, trapped between stones that were laid when the Norman kings still spoke French. At the base of the stairs, another door waits. It is thick oak, banded with iron, heavy enough to require a man's full weight to push open. The tower does not raise its voice. It simply closes the door behind you. We are standing in the lower room. It is a space built for absolute silence. The stonework here is massive, absorbing all sound, deadening the acoustics, so that a voice raised in this room barely travels beyond the heavy timber ceiling. There is a single point of light, a lone iron cresset, bolted to the wall, holding a slow-burning torch that casts long, wavering shadows across the uneven flagstones. The light does not banish the dark. It merely pushes it back into the corners, leaving the edges of the room cloaked in blackness. And there, sitting quietly in the center of the room, is the machine. From a distance, it looks entirely mundane. It looks like a heavy, oversized bed frame built by a practical carpenter who cared about sturdiness rather than elegance. It sits low to the cold ground. It is not an instrument of chaos. It is an instrument of geometry. The wood is thick, dark oak. Over the centuries, it has been smoothed by time, by the damp air, and by the oils of human skin. The air around it smells of old hemp, rendered animal fat used to grease the gears, and the deep, stale chill of the cellar. It is built on a simple rectangular chassis.
At the head and foot of the frame sit two large cylindrical wooden rollers. These cylinders are connected to a system of iron levers, ratchets, and a central windlass. It is a simple machine, relying on ancient, reliable principles of leverage and mechanical advantage. There are no spikes, there are no blades, there is no fire. It does not look like a monster. It looks like a tool. It looks like something you might find in a rope maker's shop, or a shipyard, or a weaver's guild. And that is exactly what it was. A tool designed to solve a specific administrative problem. Let us look closer at how it worked, because to understand the era, you must understand the mechanics. It was an exercise in slow, calibrated mathematics. A prisoner was laid flat on his back along the wooden bed. Heavy ropes were looped securely around his wrists and his ankles. The hemp was thick, rough against the skin, tied with knots that only tightened when pulled. These ropes were then attached to the cylinders at either end of the frame. When the men who worked the machine began their task, they did not use sudden force. Sudden force is unpredictable. Sudden force breaks things prematurely. They used a windlass, a long wooden lever inserted into a capstan. With a slow, steady, practiced push, they would turn the cylinder. The iron ratchet on the side would engage, a heavy, metallic click. The ropes would pull taut, the slack would vanish. The body would be lifted slightly off the wooden floor of the frame, suspended entirely by the tension at the wrists and the ankles. Another turn, another click. The human body is an extraordinary piece of architecture. It is held together by ligaments, tendons, and the precise, elegant fitting of ball and socket joints in the shoulders and hips. The cartilage provides a cushion. The muscles provide the strength to hold the structure rigid, to keep the bones in their proper alignment. The rack was designed to defeat this architecture, not by breaking it, but by slowly, methodically pulling it apart. Another turn, another click. As the tension increased, the muscles would spasm, fighting automatically to hold the joints together. The body wants to remain whole, the muscles lock down, burning with the effort of resisting the ropes. But the machine has no muscles to tire. The machine does not cramp. The machine does not fatigue. It has only the infinite, cold patience of leverage. Eventually, the human muscle must yield. The ligaments, stretched beyond their natural elasticity, begin to thin. They begin to separate. The shoulders pull away from the torso. The hips slip from their sockets. It was not a sudden trauma. It was a slow, creeping separation of the body's geography. A Catholic priest named William Hackett, who was laid upon this wood, later recorded that he could hear his own joints separating in the quiet room, a slow internal tearing, audible only in the deep silence of the dungeon, the body unmaking itself. As the limbs were pulled outward, the chest cavity was stretched tight, the rib cage expanded and locked, making it incredibly difficult to draw breath. The blood flow was restricted by the tension of the ropes, leaving the hands and feet cold and numb. The true horror of the rack was not in its violence, but in its slowness. It was a gradual, inexorable accumulation of tension. The men turning the levers could stop at any moment. They could hold the body in a state of suspended agony for minutes or for hours. The pain was dialed in, measured, and controlled. It was a negotiation conducted through the medium of the human skeleton. It was a conversation about loyalty and truth and treason, spoken in the language of ligaments and bone. And here is the most fascinating, contradictory fact about this room and the heavy wooden frame that sits in its center. In the medieval and early modern era, this machine was not legal. Torture was strictly forbidden under English common law. The laws of England, dating back to Magna Carta, prided themselves on their supposed civility compared to the continental laws of Europe. In France, in Spain, in the Holy Roman Empire, the questioning of a suspect with pain was a formalized, codified part of the judicial process. It was written into the statutes. In England, the common law explicitly forbade it. You could not torture a man to make him confess to a common crime. The courts would not accept it. A thief, a murderer, a highwayman, they were tried by juries, judged by evidence, and if convicted, they were hanged at the gallows. The gravediggers buried them, the priests prayed for them, the crowds watched them fall, but they were not put on the machine. So how did the Duke of Exeter's daughter find a home in the royal fortress? How did it operate for over 2 centuries? Because the rack did not belong to the common law, it belonged to the royal prerogative. It existed in a legal shadow zone, a space carved out specifically by the monarch. Torture could only be authorized by a direct, written warrant from the crown or from the monarch's inner council, the Privy Council. It was reserved for a very specific, very dangerous category of crime, treason. Crimes against the sovereign, crimes against the state. When the security of the realm was threatened, when a plot to overthrow the king was suspected, the normal rules of English law were quietly suspended. The Crown argued that the survival of the nation superseded the rights of the individual. The men who came down into this lower room were not rogue sadists acting in secret. They were high-ranking state officials. They were educated men. They were lawyers, clerks, and politicians. They wore fine clothes. They went to church on Sundays, and they never turned the windlass without paperwork. They held in their hands a piece of vellum or paper, signed by the highest authorities in the land, granting them explicit permission to apply the question. They kept precise bureaucratic records. They wrote down the date. They wrote down the names of the interrogators present. They wrote down what the prisoner was asked, what they answered, and how long they were kept on the machine. The machine in the lower room was not an instrument of lawless chaos. It was an instrument of terrifying bureaucracy. It was the state extending its power into the very tendons and joints of its citizens. The rack was simply a wooden desk where the most extreme paperwork of the Tudor and Stuart eras was completed. When the questioning was over, the tension was released. The ropes were untied. The body, often unable to support its own weight, was carried back up the worn stone stairs to a cell. The men in the fine clothes wiped their hands, rolled up their parchment, and left the room. The iron cresset was extinguished. The door was pulled shut, the lock engaged, and the Duke of Exeter's daughter was left alone in the dark, waiting patiently for the next warrant to be signed. From today's view, this looks like barbarism pretending to be justice. From their view, it was the necessary, regulated defense of the realm. And that's what's so chilling.
London, the morning of the 19th of May, 1536. A woman named Anne Boleyn, the Queen of England, steps out of the royal lodgings and walks toward a freshly built wooden scaffold. She is dressed in dark gray damask, trimmed with fur, wearing an ermine mantle against the spring chill. She climbs the short flight of wooden stairs. She looks out at the small assembly of men gathered on the grass, takes a breath, and speaks a paragraph that has been recorded in the archives for nearly 5 centuries. Listen to what she said. "I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle, and sovereign lord."
She prayed for the man who had ordered her death. She called him gentle. She called him merciful. And the worst part isn't the absolute falsehood of the words, or the tragedy of the gray damask, or the terrible stillness of the morning. The worst part is the silence around her. Because as Anne Boleyn kneels in the grass, there is no roaring crowd. There are no hawkers selling food. There are no thousands of Londoners pushing against wooden barricades to watch her fall. She is not outside on Tower Hill, where the state usually conducts its final business. She is inside the walls, on a quiet, enclosed patch of grass known as Tower Green. And that distinction, that quiet, secluded geography, changes the entire nature of the act. Tonight, we leave the machine in the lower room. Listen, the deep, heavy metallic grinding of the great key turning in the lock. The wooden door shuts behind us, leaving the Duke of Exeter's daughter in the dark. We are walking up the worn, circular stone steps, spiraling our way back to the surface. The heavy, damp smell of the subterranean world slowly gives way to the crisp, open air of the night. We emerge onto the cobbled pathways of the inner ward. The sky above is vast and dark, dusted with cold stars. To our right, the massive pale stone of the White Tower looms, an ancient, silent watcher. And straight ahead of us is stretching out in the quiet dark is Tower Green. It is a simple rectangular lawn. It is bordered by the Queen's House to the south and the small stone chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula to the north. In the daylight, it is just a pleasant patch of manicured grass where the ravens of the tower sometimes gather. But in the 16th century, this small plot of earth was the most exclusive, most terrifying, and most private theater in the English kingdom. To understand the green, you must understand the hill. For the vast majority of state prisoners, execution was a profoundly public event. It took place on Tower Hill, an elevated piece of open ground just outside the fortress walls. Executions there were civic spectacles. They drew crowds of 10,000, 20,000 people. The authorities wanted the public to see the price of treason. They wanted the noise, the scale, and the visibility. A man condemned to die on Tower Hill would be led out through the gates, surrounded by armed guards, forced to walk through a sea of screaming, shouting, surging humanity. The noise was deafening. The air smelled of unwashed bodies, roasted meat, and the Thames.
But Tower Green was different. Tower Green was reserved for a fraction of a fraction. It was an enclosed space, hidden away behind the massive outer walls. It was used only when the monarch decided that a public death was too politically dangerous, or, in a twisted royal sense, too undignified for the bloodline of the condemned. To be executed on the green was framed as a final, terrible privilege. There were no crowds. There was no roaring mob. There were only the high walls, the guards, the officials of the tower, and the silence. Once the gates were shut and the public was locked out, the fortress consumed you. In this quiet, manicured space, you belonged to the stone now. Let us look at the mechanics of this quiet place. The scaffold itself was not a permanent fixture. It was built specifically for each occasion, constructed of heavy timber by the tower carpenters in the days leading up to the event. It was raised a few feet off the grass, draped in black cloth. The wood was raw. The joints were fresh. It smelled of cut pine and the damp soil beneath it. On the wooden platform, the carpenters would lay down a thick carpet of straw to absorb what was to come. For the execution of Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII made a highly unusual, heavily documented request. He did not use the local headsman. He did not use an axe. Instead, He sent an envoy across the English Channel to Saint-Omer near Calais to hire a specialist, a master swordsman. The fee was exorbitant. Records suggest it was nearly £24, a massive sum in Tudor currency. The swordsman did not use a block. An executioner's sword is a heavy, two-handed weapon requiring extreme precision and immense physical strength. The victim does not lie flat. They kneel upright, their posture perfectly straight, their head held high. The swordsman swings horizontally, relying on momentum, mass, and a perfectly honed edge. It is a technique that requires absolute stillness from the condemned. It was framed by the Tudor court as an act of profound grace. The sword was considered a noble weapon. It was swifter than the axe, less prone to the dull, agonizing blunders that sometimes plagued the heavy iron wedges used on Tower Hill. The king, in his own mind, was giving his wife the gift of a clean, aristocratic end. The sword swung. The silence returned. 6 years later, the scaffold was rebuilt on the exact same patch of grass for another queen. Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, was condemned for treason in 1442. She was brought to the Tower in the cold of winter. The historical record notes a detail so quiet and so deeply human that it anchors the horror perfectly to the stone. The night before her death, Catherine requested that the heavy wooden block be brought into her cell.
She did not ask for it out of madness. She asked for it because she wanted to know how to arrange herself. She wanted to know how the wood would feel against her neck. She wanted to practice the physical geometry of dying so that when the morning came, she would not falter in front of the officials. Imagine that quiet room. A young woman, not yet 21 years old, kneeling on the cold flagstones in the dead of night, resting her throat against the raw oak, rehearsing the posture of her own end. The stone cold against her knees, the smell of the wood, the terrifying, inevitable stillness. But the most heartbreaking shadow on this green belongs to a girl who was even younger. Lady Jane Grey was 16 years old. She had been the Queen of England for exactly 9 days, a pawn moved across the political board by ambitious men who sought to control the throne. When the coup collapsed, the ambitious men were executed on Tower Hill, but Jane, because of her royal blood, was kept inside the walls. On the 12th of February, 1554, she was led out onto Tower Green. She wore a simple black dress. She carried a small prayer book. She climbed the wooden stairs. She spoke quietly to the small crowd, reciting a psalm in English. And then the ritual of the block began. The axe, unlike the sword, requires absolute submission to the wood. The victim must kneel, lean forward and lay their neck flat across the curved cutout of the block. Jane tied a white handkerchief around her own eyes. The world went dark. She knelt in the straw. And then she lost her bearings. Blindfolded, disoriented, and terrified, she reached out her hands to find the wood, but there was only empty air. The officials were supposed to guide her, but in the tense, awful silence, no one moved. The 16-year-old girl, kneeling in the dark, panicked. Her voice broke the silence of the green. Her exact words were written down by those who stood watching. "What shall I do? Where is it?" She fumbled in the blackness, her hands grasping at the straw. It is the moment where the polished, aristocratic ritual of the state breaks down, revealing the sheer, mechanical terror underneath. Finally, a deputy of the Tower, a man named Thomas Bridges, stepped forward. He gently took the blindfolded girl by the shoulders and guided her hands down to the wood. She found the block. She laid her head down. She did not move again. Only a handful of people ever died on Tower Green. Most of them were women. Most of them were young. When it was over, there were no grand processions. The bodies were gathered quietly, placed in simple wooden chests, and carried a few dozen yards across the grass to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. They were buried beneath the flagstones of the chapel floor. No monuments were raised, no plaques were carved. The earth was simply tamped down, the stones replaced, and the chapel doors locked. The blood on the scaffold was washed away, the timber was dismantled by the carpenters, the grass was left to grow back in the spring. When you stand on this spot today, it is just a peaceful square of lawn surrounded by ancient trees. The air is quiet. The ravens walk slowly across the grass. From today's view, this looks like a merciful alternative to the screaming mobs of the public scaffold. From their view, it was a terrifying claustrophobic erasure carried out in total silence behind locked doors. And that's what's so chilling.
Whitehall Palace, the 6th of November, 1605. A Scottish king named James I sits at a heavy oak desk and takes up a quill. He is writing an authorization regarding a man named Guy Fawkes, who has just been discovered in a cellar beneath Parliament with 36 barrels of gunpowder. The king is frightened, angry, and meticulously precise. He drafts a warrant for the man's interrogation in the Tower of London, and he includes a sentence that survives in the state archives today. Listen to his exact instruction. The gentler tortures are to be first used unto him, et sic per grados ad ima tenditur, and so by degrees to the worst. He did not ask for blind fury. He asked for a calibrated, escalating application of pain. And the worst part isn't the Latin, or the king's signature, or the massive stockpiles of gunpowder. The worst part is the bureaucratic calm of that phrase, by degrees. It reveals a system that viewed human agony not as a wild punishment, but as a surgical tool. Tonight, we are stepping away from the open grass of Tower Green. Listen. The deep, heavy, metallic grinding of the great key turning in the lock. The wind off the Thames dies down as we move indoors, walking into the administrative heart of the fortress. We are entering the lieutenant's lodgings, a sprawling, timber-framed building constructed in the 1530s, where the men who governed the tower lived and worked. The thick wooden floorboards creak gently beneath our feet. The air here smells completely different than the lower room. It smells of beeswax used to polish the oak panels, of old parchment slowly drying in the ambient air, of cold ash in a massive stone hearth, and the dry, dusty scent of heavy law books. It is a quiet, scholarly space, but it was in rooms exactly like this one, sitting at heavy oak tables by the light of tallow candles, that the interrogations were planned in the dark. To understand the men sitting at those tables, we must understand exactly what they were trying to pull out of you, and we must look at the strange, contradictory laws that governed their work. As we saw in the lower room, the rack and the manacles had no legal standing in the ordinary courts of England. If you stole a horse, or forged a coin, or murdered a neighbor, the local magistrate could not send you to the Tower to be stretched. The English common law prided itself on being free of such continental practices. Torture was a rupture in the legal fabric of the nation. It was a dark exception. It could only be summoned into existence by the highest authority in the land, the monarch, or their innermost circle, the Privy Council. Because of this, it was exceedingly rare.
In the entirety of the Tudor and Stuart eras, a period spanning over a century, there are fewer than 100 officially recorded warrants for torture. It was not a chaotic frenzy. It was a tightly controlled, heavily documented state monopoly. The men who drafted these warrants were clerks, lawyers, and bishops. They wrote them in neat cursive script. They dated them, they signed them, and they filed them away in the permanent state archives.
We step through a doorway into a smaller, adjoining study. The tower does not raise its voice. It simply closes the door behind you. Once that door was closed, the ordinary rules of justice evaporated, replaced by the crushing weight of the royal prerogative. But why? What could possibly justify this meticulous, bureaucratic suspension of the law? The answer lies in a single piece of legislation passed in 1352 under King Edward III, the Treason Act. In the medieval and early modern mind, treason was not simply a political crime, it was a profound violation of the natural order. The king was the head of the body politic, appointed by God. To plot against the sovereign was to introduce a lethal infection into the bloodstream of the nation. The 1352 Act defined high treason not just as levying war against the king, but as compassing or imagining the death of the king. It was a crime of the mind as much as the hand. If a group of men sat in a tavern and merely discussed the monarch's demise, they had committed high treason. Because the crime was so existential, so deeply corrosive to the fabric of reality, the state believed it possessed the moral and legal right to use any means necessary to root it out. The disease was fatal, therefore the medicine had to be extreme. And what exactly was the medicine? What were the interrogators trying to achieve when they ordered the windlass turned by degrees? They were not trying to punish. This is a crucial distinction. In this era, punishment was public. Punishment was the scaffold, the block, the fire, or the gallows. Punishment was for the crowds to see on Tower Hill. What happened inside these quiet rooms was an investigation. The interrogators wanted three very specific things. First, they wanted the details of the plot. They needed to know where the weapons were hidden, which ships were waiting, and when the uprising was meant to happen. Second, they wanted names. A treasonous plot is a web, and the interrogators needed to pull on the threads to find every other conspirator hiding in the dark. But the third thing they wanted was the most important. They wanted a signed confession. In the 16th-century worldview, a confession was a vital legal instrument. The courts heavily relied on the accused admitting their guilt to legitimize the execution that would inevitably follow. But it was also a deeply spiritual act. To confess was to cleanse the soul, to reconcile with God and the state before facing the end. The interrogators believed with absolute sincerity that pain could bypass the lies of the conscious mind and force the body to yield the truth. They viewed the human frame as a vessel that could be squeezed until the deceit ran out and only the facts remained. They did not see themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as men doing a grim, necessary duty to protect the realm.
When a warrant, like the one King James signed, was dispatched to the Tower, it initiated a rigid protocol. The questioning did not immediately begin with the machines. The king's instruction, "The gentler tortures are to be first used," was standard operating procedure. The process was a slow, deliberate escalation of psychological and physical pressure. The first phase was simply the geography of the tower itself. The prisoner was placed in solitary confinement, cut off from family, friends, and the outside world.
After days of silence, they were brought into a room like this one to face a panel of commissioners. The initial questioning was verbal. The commissioners would ask long, winding questions. They would bluff. They spoke calmly, evenly, and relentlessly. The clerk sat beside them, his quill scratching across the parchment, recording every word, every hesitation, every silence. If the verbal interrogation failed, the threat of pain was introduced. The prisoner would be taken down the worn stone stairs to the lower room. They would not be placed on the machine immediately. Instead, they were forced to simply look at it. This was known as the showing of the instruments. The lieutenant of the tower would explain the mechanics of the rack. He would point out the thick hemp ropes. He would demonstrate the heavy metallic click of the iron ratchets. The interrogators understood the power of anticipation. They knew that the human mind, when faced with the cold, immovable reality of the oak frame, could sometimes inflict more terror upon itself than the machine ever could. For some, the mere sight of the Duke of Exeter's daughter sitting quietly in the torchlight was enough to loosen their tongue. The confession would be given, the names whispered, and the prisoner would be led back up the stairs, trembling but unbroken. But if the prisoner remained silent, the final degree was authorized. The ropes were tied, the windlass was turned. Yet even then, the questioning continued. The interrogators stood close to the prisoner. They repeated the questions. Who provided the funds? Where did you hide the letters? Who else knew of the plot? They offered relief in exchange for a single word. It was a horrific, intimate dialogue. The state attempting to reach inside the mind of the individual, using the language of physical agony to pry open the vault of their secrets. And this is why the paperwork on these desks was so vital. The confession had to be recorded. The names had to be written down. Once the prisoner spoke, the tension was eased. The clerk would transcribe the words, and the prisoner, often with hands too damaged to hold a pen properly, would be forced to sign their name to the document. That piece of paper was the entire purpose of the endeavor. It was the physical proof that the disease of treason had been identified, isolated, and extracted. The state had its truth. The king's warrant had been fulfilled. When you look at the surviving documents today, the warrants with their royal seals, the lists of questions, the trembling signatures at the bottom of the confessions, you are looking at the architecture of a different worldview. From today's view, this looks like a paranoid state manufacturing its own evidence through terror. From their view, it was a precise, necessary procedure to protect the kingdom from annihilation. And that's what's so chilling.
London, the summer of 1546. A 25-year-old gentlewoman named Anne Askew sits in a dimly lit cell within the Tower, London. She takes up a pen, dips it into the dark ink, and writes a testimony that will outlive the men who broke her by half a millennium. Listen to what she wrote. "Then they did put me on the rack, because I confessed no ladies or gentlewomen to be of my opinion, and thereon they kept me a long time. And because I lay still and did not cry, my Lord Chancellor and Master Rich took pains to rack me with their own hands till I was nigh dead." She was put on the machine because she would not speak. She lay in the dark and refused to scream. And the worst part isn't the silence or the cold stone or the heavy oak frame. The worst part is the identity of the two men she named in that sentence. Thomas Wriothesley was the Lord Chancellor of England. Sir Richard Rich was a senior minister of the Privy Council. These men were not jailers, they were not executioners. They were the highest legal authorities in the kingdom. And Anne Askew is the only woman on historical record to ever be placed upon the rack in the long, dark history of the Tower. Tonight, we are walking back down the worn stone stairs to remember her. Listen, the deep, heavy, metallic grinding of the great key turning in the lock. The administrative rooms of the lieutenant's lodgings fade away. We leave the polished oak and the scent of beeswax behind. We are descending again into the subterranean quiet. The air grows immediately heavy. It smells of damp earth, of old salt from the tidal river, and the ancient sweating limestone. The light from a single iron cresset wavers on the walls, throwing long, slow shadows across the uneven flagstones. We are returning to the lower room. To understand how a gentlewoman found herself in this subterranean space, you must understand the dangerous, paranoid twilight of King Henry VIII's reign. It is the summer of 1546. The king is massive, immobilized by ulcerated legs, and deeply unpredictable. The English court is locked in a bitter, silent war. On one side are the religious conservatives, led by men like Wriothesley and Rich. On the other are the Protestant reformers, circling around the king's final wife, Queen Catherine Parr. The conservatives wish to destroy the queen. They believe her reformist views are a threat to the state and to the soul of the nation. But they cannot strike at her directly without absolute, undeniable proof of heresy. They need a thread to pull. They need a confession that will implicate the ladies in her inner circle, the trusted ladies of the Privy Chamber. If they can condemn the ladies, they can condemn the Queen. They find their thread in Anne Askew. Anne was an educated, fiercely Protestant woman from Lincolnshire. She was well connected. She was articulate. She was deeply devoted to the Reformed faith. She had left her husband, traveled to London, and begun distributing Protestant literature and preaching her views on the sacrament. For the men hunting the Queen, Anne's theology was merely a tool. She was arrested for heresy.
When the Privy Council interrogated her, they did not just ask about her beliefs. They asked for names. They asked her who had sent her money in prison. They asked her which gentlewomen of the court shared her opinions. They pressed her repeatedly and relentlessly to name the women closest to Catherine Parr. They wanted the Duchess of Suffolk. They wanted the Countess of Sussex. She gave them nothing. She answered their theological questions with sharp, scriptural intelligence, but when it came to names, she offered only a resolute, terrifying silence. When the verbal interrogation failed, the state moved to its ultimate mechanism. Anne was led out of her cell. She was guided down the spiraling stone stairs, down into the heavy, absolute dark. We follow her quiet footsteps on our night walk. The heavy oak door waits at the bottom of the flight. The tower does not raise its voice. It simply closes the door behind you. Once inside that room, surrounded by the thick, sound-deadening stone, you belong to the stone now. The machine sitting in the center of the room was not designed for the female frame. The mechanics of leverage, however, do not discriminate. She was laid back upon the heavy wooden bed. The rough hemp ropes were secured tightly around her wrists and her ankles. Sir Anthony Knevet, the lieutenant of the tower, was present to oversee the procedure. As the constable of the fortress, he commanded the men who worked the windlass. He was the master of the lower room. The order was given. The iron ratchet clicked. The tension was applied. The ropes pulled taut, lifting her body slightly off the wood. And Anne Askew lay perfectly still. She did not cry out. She did not speak the names of the Queen's ladies. Knevet, a man who had spent his life operating within the brutal machinery of Tudor justice, watched the young woman on the oak frame. He saw her silence. And then he did something extraordinary. He ordered his men to stop the machine.
He looked at the Lord Chancellor of England and stated clearly that he would not turn the windlass any further against a woman who was suffering so deeply and who possessed such incredible courage. In the rigid, terrified hierarchy of the Tudor state, this was a profound act of defiance. It was a quiet, dangerous act of human kindness, a small mercy in a room designed to extinguish it. Knevet turned his back on the highest ministers of the crown. He left the lower room. He climbed the stairs, walked out to the river, and immediately took a boat down the Thames to seek the king's pardon for his direct disobedience. Wriothesley and Rich were left behind in the dim, flickering light. They were furious. They were desperate. They saw their carefully constructed political plot slipping away in the absolute silence of this young woman. And so the protocol shattered entirely. The two aristocrats, men who wore heavy velvet and silk, who whispered directly into the ear of the sovereign, stripped off their heavy gowns. They stepped up to the head and the foot of the rack. They took hold of the wooden levers themselves.
It is an image of profound, quiet horror. The damp walls, the heavy breathing of the two politicians, the mechanical click of the iron gears, and the absolute stillness of the woman on the frame. Because they were not experienced executioners, because they were driven by political panic rather than the cold, calibrated patience of the professional, they turned the windlass too far. They pulled the machine until her joints were entirely separated. They unmade the geography of her body. The shoulders were pulled from their sockets, the hips were displaced, and yet through all of this slow mechanical destruction, she lay still and did not cry. When they finally stepped back, their labor finished, she was untied. Because her joints were completely displaced, she could not be lifted. She fainted from the overwhelming shock to her nervous system. She lay unconscious on the cold stone floor. When she finally revived, the Lord Chancellor of England sat down on the flagstones beside her. For 2 long hours, Wriothesley spoke quietly to the broken woman. He offered her the king's mercy. He offered her a pardon. He promised her life if she would only speak the names of the women in the queen's chamber. She refused. The state had spent its ultimate weapon, and it had failed. Anne was carried back up the stairs. She was placed in a chair in her cell. She was unable to stand. She was unable to walk, but her hands still functioned. She asked for ink and paper. She wrote down exactly what they had done, detailing the names of the men, the questions they asked, and the silence she had kept. Her manuscript was smuggled out of the fortress by sympathetic merchants. It was printed abroad, and her calm, unyielding voice survived. A few weeks later, on the 16th of July, 1546, the state carried out its final sentence. Because she was condemned as a heretic, she was not sentenced to the block on Tower Green. She was sentenced to burn at Smithfield, a public space just outside the city walls. The journey from the Tower to Smithfield is a long walk. Anne Askew could not take a single step. She was carried through the crowded streets of London in a chair, supported by 2 men. When they reached the wooden stake, there was a logistical problem. A person must stand upright to be burned, but Anne had no joints left to support her weight.
The officials brought a small wooden seat. They attached it to the heavy timber post. They lifted her out of her carrying chair, placed her gently on the small seat, and then wrapped a heavy iron chain around her waist to hold her broken body upright against the wood. The crowds watched in absolute silence. The executioner offered her a final chance to recant, holding out a written pardon from the king. She did not even look at it. She said she had not come to that place to deny her lord and master.
The torch was lowered. The wood caught fire. Anne Askew died as she had lived, in the lower room, quietly, resolutely, and without yielding a single name to the men in the fine clothes. The Queen was saved. The conservative plot failed. The young woman from Lincolnshire had held the entire weight of the Tudor state on her separated shoulders, and she had not broken. When we stand in the empty lower room today, the rack is long gone, but the stone remembers her stillness. From today's view, this looks like the martyrdom of a saint facing the cruelty of desperate men. From their view, it was the necessary, desperate application of power against an immovable threat. And that's what's so chilling. London, the early decades of the 16th century. A military commander named Sir Leonard Skeffington, serving as the lieutenant of the Tower under King Henry VIII, sits in his quarters and considers a problem of engineering. He is an administrator. He manages the guards, the provisions, the armory, and the prisoners. And he decides that the Duke of Exeter's daughter, the great wooden rack sitting in the lower room, is an imperfect tool. It is large, it is cumbersome, it pulls the human architecture apart, often leaving the prisoner permanently disabled and unable to walk to their own trial. Skeffington envisions something entirely different. He designs an instrument of iron that will eventually bear his name, corrupted by time and whispered rumors from Skeffington's gyves into something far more sinister, the Scavenger's daughter. Listen to the mechanics of his idea. If the famous rack was built on the principle of tension, pulling the body outward until the joints separated, Skeffington's machine was built on the exact opposite principle. It was a machine of compression. It crushed the body inward, folding it upon itself into a single agonizing iron hoop. The opposite of the rack, by design. Tonight, we are stepping away from the heavy oak frame in the lower room. We are taking a quiet exhale, walking past the other iron shadows that rest in the dark. Listen, the deep, heavy, metallic grinding of the great key turning in the lock. The door shuts, and we move slowly through the stone corridors. The air is perfectly still. The torches have long burned out. We are walking through a quiet, museum-like space, passing the other instruments of the 16th century. They sit silently on the cold flagstones or hang motionlessly from the walls. The iron does not rust down here. It merely darkens, turning the color of deep charcoal in the ambient damp. They are patient objects. They have waited for centuries. Let us look closely at Skeffington's invention. From a distance, it does not look like a nightmare. It looks like a heavy piece of agricultural equipment or something you might find in a shipbuilder's yard. It is an A-frame of thick, forged iron. It consists of two semicircular halves connected by a heavy, reinforced hinge at the top and fastened by a single threaded iron screw at the bottom. The point was simple. Whatever the prisoner was withholding, it would be forced out by the sheer, undeniable reality of their own mass. The body was forced into a tight, unnatural crouch. The prisoner knelt on the floor. Their head was pushed down toward their knees. Their hands were brought down to rest on their lower legs. The executioner then opened the iron A-frame, slipped the heavy hoop over the folded body, and aligned the two halves. The hinge closed. The screw was threaded.
The iron sealed the body. It went over the back. It passed under the legs. It locked at the center. As the screw was turned, the iron band contracted. It was a slow, mechanical embrace. The chest cavity was deeply compressed. The lungs were denied the physical space to expand. The blood, forced out of the extremities, was pushed inward toward the heart and the head. The body was turned into its own instrument of torture. The bones and muscles pressed against one another until the internal pressure became overwhelming. It was quiet. It was compact. It left no separated joints. It merely folded the human frame into a dark, breathless sphere. But even Skeffington's iron hoop was a rarity. As we continue down the quiet corridor, we pass a thick wooden pillar driven deep into the stone floor with heavy iron rings bolted near the high ceiling. This is the true workhorse of the Tudor and Stuart interrogators, the manacles, sometimes called the gauntlets. When people imagine the Tower of London, they immediately imagine the theatrical horror of the rack. But the rack was the exception. The manacles were the rule. They were the most commonly used method of interrogation because they were fiercely efficient, required no massive wooden frame, and left the prisoner conscious enough to answer questions. They required nothing but a wall, 2 iron cuffs, and gravity. In the autumn of 1597, a Jesuit priest named John Gerard was brought to the Tower. He was suspected of treasonous correspondence. He left a harrowing, incredibly detailed, and remarkably calm first-person account of his time in the manacles. He wrote that he was brought to a room and his hands were placed into the heavy iron rings. A wooden block was placed under his feet. The rings were locked tight around his wrists, and then the block was kicked away. Listen to the exact words he used to describe the quiet room. I felt a great pain in my breast and in my belly and in my arms and hands. I thought that all the blood in my body had run into my arms and began to burst out at my fingers' ends. He hung by his wrists. The entire weight of his body was suspended on the ball and socket joints of his shoulders. The physical reality of the gauntlets is a study in endurance. The blood retreated from the hands. The fingers went numb, then cold, then agonizingly swollen. But the interrogators did not have to turn a wheel. They did not have to sweat. They could simply stand before him with their papers and ask for names. And if Gerard did not answer, the commissioners could simply leave the room. They could go to the lieutenant's lodgings. They could sit by the fire. They could drink a cup of ale. Gerard was left hanging in the quiet dark, sometimes for hours, his toes just inches from the cold stone floor, the silence of the fortress pressing in on him. The manacles were an exercise in time, and the Tower possessed all the time in the world. We leave the manacles behind and walk to the far end of the corridor. We arrive at a small, unassuming doorway.
Here, we are not looking at a machine with moving parts. We are looking at the architecture of discomfort. We are looking at a cell carved directly into the profound thickness of the Norman walls, a space tucked beneath a heavy stone staircase. It has a name that sounds almost gentle, a terrible Tudor euphemism, Little Ease. It is a space designed with terrifying mathematical precision. It is a perfect claustrophobic cube of stone. It is too low for a man to stand upright. It is too narrow for a man to lie down flat. It is too shallow for a man to sit comfortably.
When a prisoner was placed inside, there were no ropes to bind them. There were no iron bands to compress them. There was only the room itself. The tower does not raise its voice. It simply closes the door behind you. Once inside Little Ease, the body was forced into a permanent, unnatural crouch. The prisoner could never find physical equilibrium. The muscles of the legs burned from holding the posture. The spine ached from the constant curve. The neck was continually bent. The point was simple. Sleep was rendered entirely impossible. Rest was a physical impossibility. The body was forced into a state of perpetual exhaustion, fighting a losing battle against the immutable geometry of the room. It was a space of absolute sensory deprivation. There was no light. There was only the smell of the damp stone, the cold air, and the sound of one's own breathing. The architecture itself was the interrogator. Most of the suffering in this fortress was not theatrical. It was not the grand, terrifying mechanism of the rack, tearing the body apart in a display of ultimate state power. It was much quieter. It was the slow, invisible crushing of the scavenger's daughter. It was the silent, agonizing suspension of the manacles. It was the dark, geometric claustrophobia of Little Ease. It was the state applying pressure to the human frame with the cold, bureaucratic efficiency of a clerk filing a ledger. When we walk past these objects tonight, they are just cold iron and empty space. The terror has drained out of them, leaving only the history. From today's view, this looks like an archive of nightmare machinery born from entirely sadistic minds. From their view, it was merely a pragmatic selection of tools, each designed to solve a different problem of state security. And that's what's so chilling.
London, the early 1590s. A member of Parliament and landowner named Richard Topcliffe takes a quiet, unprecedented request to the ministers of Queen Elizabeth I. He is the Crown's chief interrogator, a man who has made a career of hunting down Catholic priests hiding in the English countryside. He asks the state for permission to bypass the bureaucracy of the Tower of London entirely. He asks to build a private rack in his own home in Westminster. The state grants his request. He builds the machine. He installs it in his house. And the worst part isn't the circumvention of the law, or the extreme zeal of the interrogator, or the physical mechanics of what he built. The worst part is the domestic geography of that machine. It was in his home. It was in the same building where he ate his meals, where he entertained guests, where he slept. The screams of his prisoners echoed against the same walls that held his private life. It forces a deeply uncomfortable question. What kind of man does this work year after year, and then simply sits down to dinner? Tonight, we are not looking at the machines. We are looking at the men who stood beside them. Listen. The deep, heavy metallic grinding of the great key turning in the lock. The quiet of the fortress settles around us as we walk through the empty administrative corridors. The flagstones are cold beneath our feet. The shadows stretch long against the plaster walls. To understand the true nature of this place, we must look past the heavy oak frames and the iron manacles and look at the hands that operated them. Richard Topcliffe is the monster of the era, the man who most closely resembles the modern idea of a sadistic villain. He relished his work. He wrote long, boasting letters to the Queen, detailing his specific methods, describing how he would make men feel pain that was sharper than the rack itself. He was an educated man. He was a gentleman. He was a trusted servant of the Crown.
For a time, the state found him incredibly useful. They let him operate in the shadows, let him turn his own home into a site of terror, because he delivered the confessions they required. But Topcliffe was the exception, not the rule. Eventually, even the Tudor state found his obvious, sweating enthusiasm for pain to be unseemly. He was too loud, he was too public. The state preferred quiet professionals. It preferred bureaucracy. It eventually distanced itself from him, treating him as an embarrassment once his usefulness had faded. Because the vast majority of the men who worked in the lower rooms of the tower were not zealots like Richard Topcliffe. They were functionaries. They were men with salaries, pensions, and homes.
When a warrant for interrogation arrived at the tower, it initiated a process that was governed by clerks. These men came down the worn stone stairs carrying ledger books, wooden lap desks, and glass vials of dark iron gall ink. They wore the woolen clothes of the middle class. They set up their candles. They prepared their quills, sharpening the tips with small penknives. The tower does not raise its voice. It simply closes the door behind you. And once inside, these men did not shout. They did not froth with rage. The rackmaster, the man employed to actually turn the windlass, was a paid laborer. He received a daily wage for his work. He understood the mechanics of tension and leverage. He knew exactly how far to turn the wheel without breaking the body entirely, because a broken body could not sign the paperwork. It was a trade, learned and practiced. The horror of the lower room is not found in chaotic violence. It is found in the chilling, absolute banality of the men recording it. The clerks sat in the damp cold, their breath visible in the torchlight, writing down the questions and the answers with meticulous, beautiful penmanship. They recorded the date. They recorded the names of those present. When the prisoner screamed, the clerk did not look away in horror. He simply dipped his pen, waited for a coherent word, and wrote it down. They were performing an administrative duty. When the shift was over, they blew out the candles, wiped the ink from their fingers, and walked out into the London streets to go home to their wives and children. This strange professional detachment extended all the way to the scaffold. The executioners who worked on Tower Hill and Tower Green were not masked anonymous butchers. They were known figures. They were appointed officials who held a recognized paid office. They charged fees. They had customs, and they participated in one of the most remarkable, terrifying rituals of the Tudor era, the asking of forgiveness. When a prisoner was brought to the block, the headsman would step forward. He would kneel in the straw before the person he was about to kill, and he would ask for their forgiveness. This was not a mockery. It was a deeply sincere legal and spiritual transaction. The headsman was asking the victim to absolve him of the sin of murder, confirming that he was merely the instrument of the state, not an agent of personal malice. And the victim almost always granted it. The condemned would speak the words of forgiveness, and then they would hand the executioner a gold coin. It was a payment for a clean, swift blow. The executioner accepted the coin, stood up, and took his position. By the laws of the custom, he was also entitled to the clothes the victim wore, stripping the velvet and silk from the body after the fact as a perk of the job. It was a negotiation of death, conducted calmly on the wooden boards. But because these men were human, and because they were performing a task of immense physical and psychological pressure, the craft sometimes failed. And when the professional machinery of death broke down, the horror was absolute. On the 28th of May, 1541, a 67-year-old woman named Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, was brought to Tower Green. The regular executioner was not in London. He had been sent north. In his place, a young, inexperienced deputy was called upon to perform the execution. Margaret Pole knelt in the straw. The boy raised the heavy iron axe. He was nervous. He lacked the cold, practiced strength of the master. When the blade fell, it did not find the block cleanly. It struck the Countess on the shoulder. The ritual of the state collapsed in an instant. It was no longer a swift, aristocratic end. It was a frantic, agonizing failure. The young deputy hacked wildly at the elderly woman, requiring several desperate blows to finally end her life. The silence of the green was shattered by the terrible, clumsy reality of human error. 60 years later, on the 25th of February, 1601, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, faced a similar breakdown on the scaffold. Essex was a former favorite of Queen Elizabeth, a brilliant, arrogant military commander. He paid the executioner the gold coin. He forgave him. He lay his head upon the wood. The executioner, a professional man facing the immense pressure of executing one of the most famous men in England, swung the axe. He failed. The blow did not sever the neck. Essex moved. The headsman had to swing a second time. It failed again. It took 3 massive, terrible strokes to finish the work of the state. When the executioner finally lifted the head, the crowd on Tower Hill did not cheer. They roared in anger at the butchery. As the headsman walked home that afternoon, the crowd assaulted him, enraged by his lack of professional skill. These botched executions were recorded by the clerks with the same quiet detachment as the interrogations. The state filed the paperwork. The bodies were buried in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula. The blood was washed from the wood. The men who did this work were not mythical demons. They were ambitious courtiers like Thomas Wriothesley. They were zealous hunters like Richard Topcliffe. They were nervous deputies swinging heavy axes. They were quiet clerks worrying about the cost of tallow candles and the dampness ruining their ledgers. They were ordinary men caught in the machinery of an extraordinary era, performing duties that the state assured them were necessary, legal, and righteous. They believed they were keeping the dark at bay, unaware that they had become the dark itself. When we walk these silent corridors, we do not just feel the absence of the victims, we feel the absence of the men with the ledgers. From today's view, this looks like a system of psychopaths hidden behind the veneer of law. From their view, it was a structured professional duty required to uphold the very survival of the nation. And that's what's so chilling.
London, the dark early hours of the 5th of November, 1605. A 35-year-old soldier named Guy Fawkes is discovered in a subterranean vault beneath the House of Lords. He is standing near 36 barrels of gunpowder, hidden beneath a pile of firewood and coal. He is carrying a lantern, a pocket watch, and slow matches. He is arrested, bound, and eventually brought to the Tower of London to be questioned. But the most terrifying artifact of his time in the fortress is not the gunpowder, or the lantern, or the plot itself. It is a piece of paper. If you go to the National Archives today, you can look at 2 surviving documents signed by this man just days apart. On the first document, a confession taken before the physical interrogation began, he signs his assumed name with the firm, sweeping, confident hand of a military man. It reads clearly and proudly, Guido Fawkes. On the second document, signed after the interrogators had finished their work, the signature is unrecognizable. It is a broken, trembling scrawl. A few faint, jagged strokes form the word Guido, and then the pen simply trails off into a meaningless, weak line. The surname is absent. And the worst part isn't the political treason, or the barrels of explosive powder, or the threat to the crown. The worst part is what those two signatures, lying side by side on a desk, tell you. You do not need a single word of description to understand what happened in the dark. The paper already tells you. Tonight, we are walking deep into the silent archives of the fortress to look at the ink. Listen, the deep, heavy metallic grinding of the great key turning in the lock. The administrative corridors of the lieutenant's lodgings are quiet. The men with the ledgers have gone to sleep. The air here smells of dry parchment, oxidized iron gall ink, and the cold, dusty breath of centuries. We are standing over a heavy oak table, a single candle illuminating the space where the documents rest. To understand how a man's hand was unmade so completely, we must look at the specific, methodical machinery of the state that was arrayed against him. When Guy Fawkes was brought through the gates of the Tower, he was not a terrified civilian. He was a hardened veteran who had fought in the Spanish military. He was disciplined, committed, and entirely prepared to die. During his initial questioning, he was defiant. He refused to give his true name, calling himself John Johnson. He refused to name his co-conspirators. He looked at the highest ministers of the English government and told them calmly that his only regret was that the plot had failed. The state realized very quickly that verbal threats would not work on a soldier of this caliber. The matter was escalated directly to the sovereign. And so we return to a document we saw briefly on our walk through the previous rooms. On the 6th of November, 1605, King James I drafted the royal warrant that authorized the breaking of Guy Fawkes. It is a masterpiece of bureaucratic calm. The king wrote out a list of specific questions to be asked, and at the bottom of the page he wrote the instruction that would dictate the rest of Fawkes's life. The gentler tortures are to be first used unto him, et sic per gradus ad ima tenditur, and so, by degrees, to the worst. The king did not order an immediate chaotic assault. He ordered a perfectly calibrated descent, a structural, mechanical unraveling of a human being. The warrant was signed, it was sealed, it was delivered into the hands of the Lieutenant of the Tower, Sir William Waad. The officials took Guy Fawkes out of his holding cell. They led him down the worn stone stairs. The torches flickered against the damp walls. They walked down into the subterranean quiet of the lower room, where the heavy oak frame of the rack sat waiting in the shadows. The tower does not raise its voice. It simply closes the door behind you. Once the door to the lower room was locked, and the king's warrant was laid open on the wooden table for the clerk to see, the world of the living was left entirely behind. In the quiet dark, you belong to the stone now. We do not need to stage the violence. The horror is far deeper when we look at the quiet evidence left behind. Let us look at the first signature again. It is dated the 8th of November. Fawkes had been in the tower for several days. He had likely been shown the instruments. He had likely been subjected to the manacles hanging by his wrists from the heavy iron rings. The pain was severe, but his fundamental architecture remained intact. When the clerk pushed the paper toward him, Fawkes took the quill. He gripped it tightly. The muscles in his hand, his wrist, and his forearm worked in perfect coordinated harmony. He pressed the nib into the paper. The ink flowed dark and strong. Guido Fawkes.
It is the signature of a man who still possesses himself. But the state required more. The plot was vast, and the interrogators needed the names of every man involved. The king's warrant was absolute, ad ima tenditur, to the worst. Over the next 2 days, the interrogators moved to the final degree. Fawkes was placed upon the Duke of Exeter's daughter. The heavy hemp ropes were secured. The windlass was turned. The machine performed its cold mathematical work, applying the immense leverage of the iron ratchets against the joints, the ligaments, and the tendons of the soldier's body. We know from the historical record that Fawkes endured an extraordinary amount of time on the machine before his silence finally broke. He was a man of immense physical and mental fortitude, but the rack, as we have seen, possesses infinite patience. The tension pulled his shoulders from their sockets. It displaced his hips. It destroyed the fine, elegant mechanics of his arms and his hands. The body yielded. The names of his co-conspirators, Thomas Winter, Robert Catesby, Thomas Percy, were finally spoken into the damp air of the lower room. The clerk recorded the names, the tension was released, and then came the final, terrifying requirement of the Tudor and Stuart bureaucracy. The confession had to be signed. Look at the second document, dated the 10th of November. Fawkes could not walk. He had to be carried to the table. His arms were entirely ruined. The joints in his shoulders were separated, rendering his hands almost entirely numb and unresponsive. But the law required a signature. The officials placed the quill between his fingers. They likely had to help him steady his arm just to bring the nib down to the parchment. The human hand is a miracle of fine motor control. It requires dozens of tiny muscles acting in flawless concert to trace the loops and lines of a signature. The rack had obliterated that control. Fawkes dragged the quill across the paper. The ink blotted. The lines shook violently. He managed a faint, jagged G. He struggled through the U, the I, the D, the O, and then his physical capacity simply ran out. The pen dragged down in 2 weak, trailing vertical lines. He could not write his surname. The quill slipped from his fingers or was taken away. That broken scrawl on the page is one of the most chilling images in the English archives. It is not a painting of a man suffering. It is the direct physical residue of the suffering itself. It is the geography of pain mapped out in iron-gall ink. The silence of that trailing line speaks louder than any scream recorded in the ledgers. It is the exact moment where the state erased the individual, leaving behind only a broken mechanism that could no longer even write its own name. His confession sealed his fate, and the fate of the men he named. 2 months later, on the 31st of January, 1606, Guy Fawkes and 3 of his co-conspirators were drawn on hurdles to the old palace yard at Westminster, just outside the building they had intended to destroy. The sentence for high treason was hanging, drawing, and quartering, a public, visceral, and drawn-out execution designed to dismantle the traitor's body in front of the crowds. It was the ultimate physical punishment the state could inflict. But Guy Fawkes, even broken, retained a final, quiet agency. When it was his turn to climb the wooden ladder to the hangman's noose, he could barely move. The damage inflicted in the lower room of the tower was permanent. He was weak, trembling, and had to be assisted by the executioner and the guards just to ascend the steps. The crowd watched in the cold January air.
The noose was placed around his neck. The procedure required the executioner to hang the victim only briefly, cutting them down while they were still alive to face the horrors of the quartering block. Fawkes knew the protocol. He knew what awaited him on the wooden table below. As he stood on the ladder, he did not wait to be pushed. He did not wait for the executioner to slowly lower him. He gathered whatever fractured strength remained in his body, and he jumped. He threw himself from the ladder with enough force to break his own neck. He died instantly, suspended in the cold air, denying the state the final agonizing theater of the drawing and quartering while he lived. His body was subjected to the rest of the sentence, as the law required, but he was gone. He had escaped them. The crowds dispersed. The wooden scaffold was dismantled. The state filed its paperwork. The king's warrant was marked as fulfilled. The gunpowder plot was extinguished, passing into legend, bonfire nights, and fireworks. But inside the silent archives, the paper remains. The documents sit in the quiet dark, holding the ink exactly as it dried. The first signature, bold and unbroken. The second signature, a fragile, shivering ghost, trailing off into nothingness. When you look at those two pieces of paper, you are looking at the absolute, terrifying power of the fortress made visible. You are looking at a machine that could take a hardened soldier and turn him into a man who could not hold a feather. From today's view, this looks like a profound tragedy of physical destruction captured on vellum. From their view, it was the necessary, documented proof that the truth had finally been extracted. And that's what's so chilling.
London, the 22nd of June, 1587. A nobleman named Philip Howard, the Earl of Arundel, stands in a circular room inside the Beauchamp Tower. He was once the premier Earl of England, a favorite of Queen Elizabeth I. Now he has been stripped of his lands. He has been stripped of his titles. He has been separated from his wife, whom he will never see again. He takes a small, hard implement, perhaps a rusty nail, perhaps a piece of flint, and begins to scrape away the surface of the limestone wall. Listen to what he carved. Quanto plus afflictiones pro Christo in hoc seculo, tanto plus gloriae cum Christo in futuro. The more affliction for Christ in this world, the more glory with Christ in the world to come. He carved his name underneath. He carved the date. And the most remarkable part isn't the flawless Latin, or the depth of his faith, or the sheer tragedy of his imprisonment. The most remarkable part is the permanence of the quiet act. The Tudor state was built to take absolutely everything from a person, their freedom, their identity, their future, their life. And yet, the one thing the fortress could not stop them from doing was leaving their names in the wall. Tonight, we are leaving the administrative quarters and the heavy wooden frames of the lower room behind. We are taking a deep, quiet exhale. Listen. The deep, heavy metallic grinding of the great key turning in the lock. We are walking out into the open air of the inner ward. The atmosphere here is entirely different from the subterranean damp. The night air is crisp and cold. The grass is soft beneath our feet. The massive, pale stone of the White Tower looms in the center of the complex, glowing faintly under the moonlight. We move toward the western wall of the fortress, toward a massive 3-storied defensive bastion built in the 13th century. We climb the short, curving stone steps into the Beauchamp Tower. In the Tudor era, this military bastion was repurposed. It became a holding pen for high-ranking prisoners of state, men of noble blood who were waiting for the crown to decide their fate. The walls here are incredibly thick, built to withstand the impact of medieval siege engines. The windows are narrow slits, letting in only thin blades of sunlight during the day and the pale wash of the moon at night. The tower does not raise its voice, it simply closes the door behind you. But once the heavy door was closed, the atmosphere in this particular room shifted entirely. Down in the lower room, the space was dominated by the machinery of the state. The rack and the iron hoops were the tools of the interrogator. Up here, in the quiet circular rooms of the Beauchamp Tower, the space is dominated by the prisoners themselves. The walls of this tower are covered, absolutely covered, in carved graffiti. There are hundreds of individual inscriptions overlapping, competing for space on the pale limestone blocks. There are names, there are prayers, there are dates, there are elaborate heraldic devices, crests and coats of arms.
To understand the emotional weight of this room, you must understand the sheer, overwhelming physical reality of cutting stone. Limestone is not soft. It is not wood. It does not yield easily to a dull iron nail or a broken spoon or a piece of metal pried from a boot heel. To cut a single letter into the block requires thousands of repetitive, deliberate motions. It requires immense friction. It requires unrelenting pressure. The stone dust falls softly onto the wooden floorboards. The fingers cramp. The knuckles bleed. And yet they kept carving. They carved because they had nothing but time. The wait for a trial, the wait for a royal pardon, or the wait for the executioner could last for months or even years. Philip Howard waited in the tower for exactly 10 years and 6 months. 10 years of watching the seasons change through a single arrow slit. The carving became a metronome for the waiting mind. It was a way to organize the endless, terrifying stretch of hours. When the interrogators told a prisoner that they were forgotten, that the outside world had moved on without them, the prisoner turned to the wall. They pressed their hands against the cold surface. In the silence of the fortress, you belong to the stone now. But here, the prisoners inverted that terrible truth. If they belonged to the stone, then the stone would belong to them. They quite literally became part of the architecture, turning a prison into a permanent archive. It is the gentlest, warmest, most profoundly human space in the entire complex. Let us look at some of the names. On the wall of the main chamber, there is a large, incredibly intricate carving left by the Dudley brothers. In 1553, after the failed attempt to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne, 4 brothers from the powerful Dudley family were locked in this room: Ambrose, Robert, Guilford, and Henry. They were young men, suddenly stripped of all power, their father already executed on Tower Hill. Their own fate was entirely uncertain, and together, over the course of many months, they carved a masterpiece into the wall. It is a massive heraldic badge, nearly 2 feet square. It features a bear and a ragged staff, the traditional emblem of their family, surrounded by an elaborate, intertwining floral border. The border is not merely decorative, it is a botanical code, a puzzle built from the names of the 4 brothers. There are roses for Ambrose. There are oak leaves, derived from robur, the Latin for oak, to represent Robert. There are honeysuckle flowers for Henry, and there are gillyflowers for Guilford. Think of the patience required to carve a delicate, curving petal of a rose into hard limestone with a crude tool. Think of the quiet conversations the brothers must have had in the dim light, taking turns at the wall,
working together to ensure their family name and their honor survived, even if their bodies did not. And just a few feet away from the Dudley carving, there is something even more heart-wrenching in its simplicity. It is not an elaborate crest. It is not a Latin poem. It is a single word, carved deeply and sharply into the block. 4 letters: Jane. It was carved by Guildford Dudley, the young husband of Lady Jane Grey, the 16-year-old girl who lost her bearings on the scaffold on Tower Green. He did not carve his own name. He carved hers. He sat in the cold, knowing that she was being held in a different building just a few dozen yards away across the grass, knowing they would never see each other again, and he pressed her name into the stone so that it would outlast the monarch who ordered their deaths. In another corner of the room, dating back to 1540, there is a carving left by a Catholic priest named Thomas Abel. He had been a chaplain to Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife, and he was imprisoned for refusing to accept the king's divorce. He knew he was going to die, but even in the shadow of the executioner, his humanity and his wit did not vanish. He carved a rebus, a visual pun on his own name. He carved the shape of a large church bell, and upon the bell he carved the letter A. A bell. Abel. It is a brilliant, playful, deeply human gesture. A man sitting in the dark, facing the absolute power of the Tudor state, making a small joke on the wall to prove that his mind was still his own. The horror of the tower recedes in the face of this quiet dignity. The machinery of pain fades away, leaving only a priest smiling slightly as he finishes the curve of a carved bell. And here is the most beautiful, transcendent fact about the Beauchamp Tower. These carvings did not disappear. They were not washed away like the blood on the scaffold. They were not dismantled and burned like the heavy oak frames. They survived. The state designed the fortress to be an engine of forgetting. It executed traitors, buried them beneath the floorboards of the chapel without a marker, and demanded that the nation forget they ever existed. But the wall remembers. The wall holds the names. You can walk into the Beauchamp Tower today, in the 21st century. You can stand in the exact spot where Philip Howard stood in 1587. You can lean in close to the pale limestone. You can see the sharp, deliberate edges of the letters he cut. You can trace the outline of Thomas Abel's bell. You can read the single word, Jane. The light falls through the narrow slit window and catches the depth of the lines, casting tiny, delicate shadows inside the letters, just as it did 400 years ago. When you stand there, time collapses. You can place your hand inches from where their hands rested. The dust from their carvings settled on the floorboards centuries ago, but the intention remains perfectly intact. They are not victims in this room. They are authors. They claimed the space, and they claimed the history. From today's view, this looks like an archive of despair, written by people with nothing left to lose. From their view, it was a quiet, permanent triumph of memory over erasure. And that's what's so chilling.
London, the summer of 1546. A military man named Sir Anthony Knevet, the lieutenant of the Tower of London, stands in the subterranean damp of the lower room. He is watching a 25-year-old woman named Anne Askew lie perfectly still on the heavy oak frame of the rack. He is the master of this fortress. The men turning the wooden windlass answer to him, and as he watches the silent, terrible suffering of the woman on the wood, the Lord Chancellor of England orders him to turn the machine again. Listen to what Knevet did. He looked at the highest legal authority in the kingdom, and he simply said, no. He ordered his men to step away from the levers. He refused to participate any further.
And the most remarkable part isn't the political danger of his refusal, or the fury of the Lord Chancellor, or the absolute silence of the room that followed. The most remarkable part is the profound, quiet humanity of the act. In a fortress designed entirely to extinguish the individual, a man looked at the machinery of the state and chose mercy over obedience. Tonight, the wind off the river is gentle, the night is deepening, and the shadows are growing softer. Listen, the deep, heavy metallic grinding of the great key turning in the lock, turning slower now, the heavy iron moving with a quiet, patient grace. We are walking away from the Beauchamp Tower, moving slowly across the open grass of the inner ward. The sky above is a vast, calm canopy of dark velvet and cold stars. For the past 8 chapters, we have walked through the architecture of state terror. We have looked at the iron, the warrants, and the cold stone. But the tower is not merely a monolith of cruelty. Wherever there are human beings, even in the darkest, most heavily fortified spaces on earth, there are tiny, brilliant fractures of light. There are acts of quiet grace. Tonight, before we leave this place, we are going to gather 3 small mercies. We are going to look at the documented, historical kindnesses that pierced the gloom and give them the reverence they deserve. The first mercy belongs to Sir Anthony Knevet, a man whose quiet defiance we saw planted in the dark of the lower room. To understand the weight of his refusal, you must understand the risk. To deny a direct order from the Lord Chancellor in the presence of the Privy Council during the paranoid final years of King Henry VIII was an act of political suicide. It was the kind of defiance that frequently ended on the scaffold of Tower Hill. But Knevet did not waver. When Thomas Wriothesley and Richard Rich stripped off their heavy velvet gowns to turn the windlass themselves, Knevet did not stay to watch. He turned his back on them. He walked out of the lower room. He climbed the worn stone stairs, leaving the dampness and the terror behind him.
He walked out of the fortress gates, went directly to the banks of the Thames, and boarded a small boat. The oars dipped into the cold, dark water. The rhythm was steady. The river carried him downstream to the royal palaces, where he sought an immediate audience with King Henry VIII. He walked into the royal presence and threw himself at the king's feet. He confessed his disobedience. He explained that he could not, in good conscience, continue to break a young woman who was already so entirely ruined, simply to satisfy the political desperation of the Chancellor. And the king, in a rare, unpredictable moment of grace, pardoned him. Henry accepted his reasoning and absolved him of his defiance. The machinery of the state stopped, even if just for one man, for one afternoon. Knevet risked his own life, his own head, for a woman he barely knew, simply because his conscience demanded it. It was a small mercy of intervention. The second mercy is quieter. It is the mercy of permission, granted by the ordinary men who guarded the doors. We walk toward a timber-framed building near the center of the complex, the house of the gentleman jailer, a man named Nathaniel Partridge. It is the evening of the 11th of February, 1554. In a small room on the upper floor, 16-year-old Lady Jane Grey is spending her final night on earth. She knows that when the sun rises, she will be led out to the wooden block on Tower Green. She is surrounded by guards. She is entirely cut off from her family. But her keeper, Partridge, and the warders assigned to her do not treat her with cruelty.
The men who worked as guards in the tower were often deeply sympathetic to the people they held. They were the ones who brought extra firewood in the dead of winter. They were the ones who occasionally looked the other way when a piece of paper changed hands. On this final night, the guards allowed Jane a candle. They allowed her a quill and a vial of iron gall ink, and they allowed her to keep her own personal prayer book, a small, beautifully bound Greek New Testament. The book was bound in dark leather, the pages were fine vellum, the text was printed in neat, beautiful Greek. Jane sat by the candlelight, opened the book to the blank margins at the back, and wrote a long, final letter to her younger sister, Catherine. She wrote in English, her elegant script wrapping around the edges of the printed Greek. She told her sister to live a good life, to trust in God, and not to weep for her. When she was finished, the warders did not confiscate the book. They did not hand it over to the state as evidence. They allowed it to pass to the lieutenant of the tower or to her gentle one, with the explicit promise that it would be delivered to her sister. And it was. The book survived. The letter survived. The warders could have enforced absolute isolation, but instead they offered the small mercy of a final connection. They allowed a 16-year-old girl to say goodbye.
The third mercy is the most expansive. It is the mercy of the mind. We walk slowly toward a massive, heavy stone gateway known as the Bloody Tower. The name is a Victorian invention. In the era we are visiting, it was simply called the Garden Tower. And for 13 long years, from 1603 to 1616, it was the home of Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh was a famous explorer, a poet, a courtier, and a scholar. He was condemned for treason by King James I, the same king who ordered the breaking of Guy Fawkes. But Raleigh's experience in the fortress was entirely different. Because of his high status, and because the crown was content to simply keep him out of the political sphere, he was granted extraordinary permissions. The tower does not raise its voice, it simply closes the door behind you. They told Raleigh that his public life was over. They told him that his explorations were finished. They told him that in this dark room, you belong to the stone now. But Raleigh refused to let the stone shrink his world, and the state, in a remarkable display of administrative leniency, allowed him to expand it. They permitted him his own furniture. They allowed him his clothing, his tapestries, and his servants. Most importantly, they allowed him his books. He brought over 500 heavy, leather-bound volumes into his cell. He turned a medieval prison into a private university. The warders allowed him to use a small, quiet patch of earth just outside his door, transforming it into a private garden. There he grew exotic plants. He cultivated tobacco from the New World, the rich, sweet smell of the smoke drifting over the ancient battlements. They allowed him to set up a chemical laboratory in a defunct henhouse on the grounds. He brought in glass alembics, copper stills, and small furnaces. He spent his days distilling herbal cordials, compounding medicines, and studying the natural world. And most beautifully, they allowed him his family. His wife Bess was permitted to live with him in the tower for extended periods. They shared meals. They shared the quiet evenings. In 1605, while living inside the fortress walls, Bess gave birth to their son, Carew Raleigh. Imagine the sound of a child's laughter echoing down the heavy stone corridors. Imagine the warmth of a family living, loving, and growing inside a building designed for death. Surrounded by his books, his scientific instruments, and his family, Raleigh sat at his desk and began to write.
he wrote an immense, sprawling masterpiece called The History of the World. The state had locked his body inside a stone box, but they had left his mind completely untethered. He traveled through the ancient empires of Greece and Rome, mapping the history of human civilization while looking out through a barred window. The point was simple. The body may be confined, but the intellect cannot be imprisoned.
These three mercies, a hand refusing to turn a wheel, a candle granted for a final letter, a library built inside a cell, do not erase the heavy oak frames. They do not wash away the blood on Tower Green, but they are the quiet, undeniable proof that the fortress could not extinguish the human spirit. Even in the darkest rooms, empathy, love, and intellectual curiosity survived. The warders, the lieutenants, and the prisoners themselves pushed back against the cold geometry of the state with small, persistent acts of grace. When we walk the paths of the inner ward tonight, the air feels a little warmer. The silence is not empty, it is peaceful. From today's view, this looks like simple human decency surviving in a hostile architecture. From their view, it was a quiet, dangerous rebellion against the absolute power of the crown. And that's what's so chilling.
London, the late 17th century. A monarch named King Charles II issues a royal decree regarding the ancient fortress on the edge of the city. He is responding to a superstitious whisper, a dark legend that claims the entire kingdom and the great white tower itself will fall if the resident ravens ever leave the grounds. He orders that 6 of the massive black-feathered birds must be protected and kept within the walls at all times. Listen to the reality of that command today. In the 21st century, a dedicated yeoman warder holding the official title of Raven Master still tends to their descendants. He feeds them raw meat and biscuits soaked in blood. He clips their flight feathers with quiet precision. He watches them patrol the manicured grass of the inner ward. And the most remarkable part isn't the superstition or the archaic royal decree or the dark shape of the birds against the pale limestone. The most remarkable part is the unbroken, staggering continuity of the place. Every human being we have walked beside tonight is gone. They are ash at Smithfield. They are dust beneath the chapel floorboards. But the stone they touched is not. Tonight, our long journey through the centuries is coming to a close. Listen, the deep, heavy, metallic grinding of the great key turning in the lock, turning one final time, seating itself perfectly in the iron wards, and then at last falling perfectly still. We are standing in the center of the inner ward. The night is quiet. The wind off the River Thames has settled into a gentle, rhythmic breath, carrying the faint scent of salt, damp earth, and old water. The moonlight washes over the concentric walls, painting the fortress in shades of silver and deep charcoal. For nearly 1,000 years, this massive complex of Norman architecture has dominated the landscape. It was begun by William the Conqueror in the 1070s. It was built to terrify the local population, a colossal, immovable statement of absolute royal power pressing down on the edge of the city. Over the centuries, it has served as a sprawling royal palace, a heavily guarded armory, a royal mint churning out silver coins, and a menagerie for exotic animals gifted to the crown. Today, it is a bustling, world-famous museum.
By day, the wide cobbled paths are filled with thousands of visitors. They come from all over the globe to stand in the long lines. They come to see the crown jewels, the diamonds and gold gleaming brightly behind thick, bomb-proof glass. They buy souvenirs in the gift shops. They take photographs of the yeoman warders, the famous beefeaters in their dark blue and red undress uniforms. The tower functions as a small enclosed village. The warders and their families actually live within the walls. They have their own doctor. They have their own pub. It is a place of bright noise, of guided tours, of modern distraction, and of vibrant daily life.
But we know what happens when the daylight fades. The visitors leave, the guides go home, the heavy wooden doors are bolted, the iron gates are shut firmly against the sprawling, neon-lit modern city of London. The tower does not raise its voice, it simply closes the door behind you. And in that deep, echoing silence, the true nature of the fortress reveals itself. It ceases to be a crowded tourist attraction and becomes exactly what it has always been, a keeper, a vast architectural vault holding the heaviest, darkest memories of the English nation. Let us take a slow, reflective walk past the doorways we have opened tonight, gathering the fragmented pieces of the past. We move softly across the manicured grass of Tower Green. We can look at the quiet patch of lawn where a 16-year-old girl named Lady Jane Grey once knelt in the straw. The raw timber scaffold is gone. The heavy wooden block is gone. The white blindfold is gone. There is only the quiet rustle of the leaves in the ancient trees, the shadow of the chapel, and the peaceful earth. The mechanical terror of her final moments has evaporated into the centuries, leaving behind only the profound, heartbreaking dignity of her memory. We look toward the timber-framed lieutenants' lodgings, where the clerks once sat with their heavy ledger books and their glass vials of iron-gall ink. The warrants they wrote, the carefully drafted royal orders to apply pain by degrees, are no longer active instruments of state power. They are just fragile, yellowing pieces of paper, filed away carefully in the silent, climate-controlled reading rooms of the National Archives. They have no authority over the living. King James I is gone. His royal seal is dry. But the trembling, broken scrawl of Guy Fawkes remains on the page, an enduring physical testament to the absolute limits of the human body and the terrifying machinery of the law. We cast our eyes toward the heavy, dark base of the White Tower, where the uneven subterranean stairs lead down to the lower room. The Duke of Exeter's daughter, the heavy oak frame of the rack, is no longer waiting in the shadows. The iron ratchets are silent. The thick hemp ropes have rotted away to nothing. We can think of Anne Askew lying perfectly still on that damp wood, holding the entire weight of the Tudor state on her separated shoulders. The men who took off their velvet gowns to turn the windlass with their own hands, Thomas Wrottesley, Richard Rich, are buried in their grand, silent tombs, their desperate political plots entirely forgotten by the modern world. But Anne Askew's calm, unyielding voice survived. Her written words outlasted their violence. The executioners, the torturers, the zealous interrogators like Richard Topcliffe, they are all gone. Their cruelty was temporary. Their power was a terrifying illusion, bound entirely to the fleeting breath of the monarchs they served. When the kings and queens died, the warrants expired. The machinery of pain was eventually dismantled.
The laws of England shifted, turning away from the rack, the manacles, and the crushing weight of the scavenger's daughter, consigning them to the dark corners of history.
The cruelty faded, but the stone remained. And that brings us to the central, quiet victory of the Tower of London. The Tudor state built these specific walls to contain the people it feared. It locked them in the dark. It told them they were forgotten by the outside world. It told them, in the absolute silence of the deep cells, that you belong to the stone now. It was meant to be a sentence of permanent erasure. It was meant to be the end of their identity, their history, and their names. But the prisoners, in a massive, collective act of quiet defiance, inverted that sentence. They took the cold, unyielding limestone and they made it their own. We look up at the heavy, three-story defensive bastion of the Beauchamp Tower. Inside those thick, circular rooms, the walls are still covered in the intricate, overlapping carvings of the men and women who waited for the end. The Dudley brothers' elaborate floral code, carefully hiding their names in petals and leaves. Thomas Abel's clever smiling bell, carved in the shadow of the executioner. Philip Howard's flawless, deeply cut Latin prayer. And the single, heartbreaking word, Jane, pressed into the rock by a desperate young husband who had nothing else to give her. These are not monuments built by the state. They are not grand statues erected by victorious armies in public squares. They are the quiet, patient, desperate voices of the individuals the state actively tried to erase. The tower tried to take their names, and they responded by carving those exact names into the very architecture of their imprisonment. They became the stone, yes, but in doing so, they ensured the stone would carry their memory forward forever, long after the state that condemned them had crumbled. The point was simple. Memory is heavier than iron. The iron hoops rust, the oak frames splinter and burn, the executioner's sword dulls and breaks, but the limestone holds the cut. The limestone remembers the intense friction of the nail, the steady, aching pressure of the hand, the quiet breathing of the carver in the dark. The fortress that was designed to be the ultimate engine of forgetting became, against its own intent, the greatest, most permanent archive of human endurance in the English world. When you walk past these ancient, towering walls tonight, you are not just walking past a catalog of medieval horrors. You are walking past a vast, quiet monument to survival. You are walking past the undeniable physical proof that even in the face of absolute, terrifying power, the human spirit refuses to be completely extinguished. It leaves a mark. It leaves a name. It leaves a delicate rose petal carved permanently into a cold wall.
The night is coming to an end. Our long walk is finally over. The great key has turned, the gates are locked, and the fortress will sleep now. It will wait for the dawn, wait for the ravens to wake on the green, and wait for the modern world to return with its noise, its cameras, and its light. But before we leave this place entirely, we must take one of those memories with us. We must lift one of those surviving objects out of the dark of the 16th century and carry it gently forward into the light of our own time. We are going to look closely at those profound carvings in the Beauchamp Tower, and we are going to bring them into the quiet, safe space of the present-day archive. From today's view, the Tower of London looks like a dark, immovable monument to a brutal and unforgiving past. From the view of the stone, it is a permanent, unbreakable vault of human memory, keeping the names of the lost perfectly safe. And that's what's so chilling.
London, The year 2026. The sun rises slowly over the River Thames, catching the glass and steel of the modern city. The Shard gleams in the morning light. The bridges are heavy with the rush of commuters, the red double-decker buses, the quiet hum of electric taxis, and the endless, vibrant noise of the 21st century. But sitting quietly on the north bank of the river, surrounded by a manicured, dry moat, the pale limestone of the ancient fortress remains perfectly still. It does not change. It merely watches the centuries wash against its walls. Today, the Tower of London is a living, breathing museum. It is managed by an organization called Historic Royal Palaces. When you visit it now, you walk across a paved causeway. You pass through security checks. You see children eating ice cream on the wide cobbled paths, and you hear the booming, theatrical voices of the yeoman warders delivering tours to crowds of tourists holding up their cell phones. It is a place of bright light, of education, and of careful preservation. But if you step away from the crowds waiting to see the crown jewels, if you walk across the inner ward and climb the short, worn stone steps into the Beauchamp Tower, the bright noise of the modern city begins to fade. The air grows cool. The light softens, filtering through the narrow arrow slits just as it did 500 years ago. You can stand in the center of that circular room today, in 2026. You can walk right up to the pale limestone blocks, and you can see them. The carvings are still there. They have not been worn away by the damp. They have not been erased by the state. You can look at the elaborate heraldic badge of the Dudley brothers. You can trace the outline of the bear and the ragged staff with your eyes. You can see the delicate oak leaves carved for Robert, the roses for Ambrose, the honeycomb for Henry, and the gillyflowers for Guilford. The botanical code remains unbroken. Just a few feet away, you can look at the single, deeply cut word, Jane. The edges of the letters are still sharp. The intention of the young man who held the nail is still perfectly legible. You can read the flawless Latin of Philip Harold, the Earl of Arundel, still offering his affliction to his God. Quanto plus afflictionis pro Christo in hoc seculo, tanto plus gloriae cum Christo in futuro. The paper records of this dark era are kept far away from the damp stone. If you take the train to the National Archives at Kew, you can request to see the royal warrants. In a quiet, climate-controlled reading room, under the soft glow of modern preservation lights, you can look at the trembling, broken signature of Guy Fawkes. You can see the precise bureaucratic handwriting of the clerks. And if you go to the Royal Armories in Leeds, they hold the heavy iron manacles and the terrifying remnants of the Tudor machinery.
But the names remain in the Beauchamp Tower. The state intended this fortress to be a place of absolute erasure. They believed that by locking these men and women away in the dark, they could remove them from history. But the prisoners understood something the state did not. They understood that the limestone was a canvas. They took the very instrument of their confinement, the heavy, unyielding architecture of the fortress itself, and they turned it into a permanent archive of their own existence. In doing so, they achieved a quiet, absolute victory over the monarchs who condemned them. The kings and queens are gone. The Lord Chancellors and zealous interrogators are dust. The heavy wooden frames have splintered and vanished, but the names in the wall remain. When a prisoner was brought into these cold rooms, the state whispered a terrifying promise. They told them that they were forgotten. They told them that in the absolute dark you belong to the stone. But time has turned that curse into a benediction. They do belong to the stone.
The stone kept them. The stone held their names, protected their prayers, and carried their memory safely across half a millennium, delivering it into the light of the 21st century, where you can stand today and bear witness to their survival. The darkness did not win. The memory won. The tower does not raise its voice. It simply closes the door behind you. But tonight, that closed door is not a trap. It is a quiet room where the past is kept safe, waiting patiently for anyone willing to stop and read the writing on the wall. Our night walk is over. The great key has turned for the final time. The fortress is entirely at peace. As you lie in the dark, let the weight of the stone fall away. Let the cool air of the Thames carry you toward rest. You are safe. The history is securely archived, and the modern morning is waiting for you when you wake. Sleep well, sleepyheads. We will walk again through another quiet corner of the past, whenever you are ready. And if you found comfort in our journey tonight, please consider subscribing to the channel. The archive is always open, and there is always another story waiting in the dark. Good night.